Ever heard of the time when people danced to their death?
Crazy, right?
Yeah.
Buckle up, because today's deep dive is taking us straight into one of history's strangest events, the Dancing Plague of 1518.
Oh, okay.
Picture this. It's a scorching summer in Strasbourg. The year is 1518. Now, life in the 16th century wasn't exactly sunshine and rainbows, but things are about to get a whole lot weirder.
Okay.
It all starts with a woman named Frau Troffea. Out of nowhere, she's overcome by this uncontrollable urge to dance.
Oh, wow.
And I'm not talking about a little jig in the marketplace.
We're talking frantic, wild, almost possessed-looking movements.
Naturally, people are staring.
Yeah.
But here's where it gets truly bizarre. Frau Troffea doesn't stop. Day and night, she dances.
Well,
It's as if some unseen force has taken hold of her body, driving her to the brink of exhaustion.
what's fascinating here is how this bizarre incident, which could have been dismissed as an isolated case, quickly spirals into a mass phenomenon. And this is where your sources really paint a vivid picture of Strasbourg at the time. Religious fervor, recent hardship, a lingering sense of unease. It's a tinderbox ready to ignite.
And ignite it does. It starts with a handful of people seemingly catching Frau Troffea's affliction. Then dozens. Then hundreds. Imagine entire town squares overflowing with people dancing themselves to exhaustion, to injury, even to death.
Wow.
Now, you'd think someone would step in, right? Try to stop the madness. But the authorities, well-intentioned as they might have been, make a critical error.
What's that?
They bring in the music.
Oh, no.
They think maybe if we give them some structure, some rhythm, it'll help regulate this chaotic dancing.
A logical, if misguided, attempt. You see, music back then wasn't just entertainment. It was an integral part of life, used in celebrations, rituals, even as a tool to try and restore balance. The authorities thought they were offering a cure, but in reality, they were adding fuel to the fire. They completely misunderstood the nature of the affliction gripping their town.
Yeah, talk about a historical facepalm moment. And here's where it gets even wilder. This Strasbourg incident, it wasn't an isolated incident. We've seen this before, haven't we? The Dancing Plague.
Precisely. The Aachen event in 1374. Hundreds afflicted with the same uncontrollable dancing mania centuries earlier. So we're not dealing with a unique occurrence, but rather an echo of history. These recurring events point to a deeper, more complex phenomenon at play. It begs the question, if it happened multiple times across different places and times, what's to say it couldn't happen again?
Okay, now you're really freaking me out here. So let's talk theories. What could possibly explain hundreds of people suddenly dancing themselves to death? Give me the historical deep dive. What are we looking at?
Well, let's start with a theory that tends to capture the imagination most vividly. Mass hysteria.
Okay.
Imagine a community under immense stress, like Strasbourg in 1518.
Right.
They've just endured famine, disease, the constant uncertainty of life in that era. This collective anxiety, this shared trauma, it creates a breeding ground for what we call conversion disorder.
Now, conversion disorder is a fascinating phenomenon where psychological stress manifests as physical symptoms. Think of it like those cases where students at a school simultaneously develop mysterious headaches or fainting spells, all because of the immense pressure they're under.
So, kind of like a collective freakout. But instead of screaming, it's uncontrollable dancing.
Exactly. And this is where the societal norms of the time come into play. Public dancing was common, often linked to religious rituals and festivals. So in a state of heightened stress and suggestibility, people might have unconsciously mimicked the behavior of others, leading to a contagious spread of dancing mania. It's like a runaway train of social contagion.
Okay, that makes a certain amount of sense, but our sources mention other possibilities too, right? What about this ergot poisoning? Now that sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi novel.
It does sound like science fiction, doesn't it? But ergot poisoning was a very real threat in medieval Europe. Urgot is a fungus that grows on rye, a staple grain at the time. Now, when consumed, ergot can cause ergotism, a condition with some rather unsettling symptoms.
Okay, you've piqued my curiosity. Unsettling how?
We're talking hallucinations, convulsions, and get this, uncontrollable spasms that could easily be misinterpreted as dancing.
Now, remember how Strasbourg had recently suffered from a devastating famine?
Right.
People were desperate. It's not hard to imagine them consuming mold-infested rye out of sheer necessity, unknowingly poisoning themselves.
So imagine, you're already on edge from famine, you're seeing your neighbors dance uncontrollably, and then you start experiencing hallucinations and convulsions from the ergot. Suddenly that dancing plague doesn't seem so far-fetched, does it?
Precisely. It's a chilling thought, isn't it? And it highlights the importance of understanding the historical context of these events. It's easy to dismiss the dancing plague as mass hysteria, But what if it was, at least in part, a result of a very real, very frightening medical condition?
Okay, so we've got social contagion, we've got accidental poisoning. Anything else our sources bring up?
We can't discount the role of religion and superstition, especially in 16th century Europe. This was a time when faith permeated every aspect of life, and this is where St. Vitus enters the picture.
Wait, St. Vitus as in the patron saint of dancers.
During a dancing plague? You've got to be kidding me.
It's quite the coincidence, isn't it? But here's the thing. St. Vitus wasn't just associated with dancing. He was also connected to epilepsy, a condition often characterized by seizures and convulsions.
So people are dropping left and right, gripped by this uncontrollable dancing frenzy, and they're looking for answers, looking for someone to blame.
And who better to blame than the patron saint of dancers? It's not hard to imagine how, in the throes of this inexplicable epidemic, people might believe they were cursed by St. Vitus himself.
Fear, superstition, religious fervor. It's like a recipe for mass hysteria, wouldn't you say?
Indeed. And this wasn't just a fringe belief. Some accounts suggest that people were sent to shrines dedicated to St. Vitus to pray for a cure, further solidifying the connection between the dancing plague and divine intervention. They were literally dancing their way to the very figure they believed was cursing them.
Okay, so we've got mass hysteria, accidental poisoning, and the wrath of the dancing saint. It's like a historical mystery buffet. But are there any theories out there that are a little more, grounded in modern science?
There is one more theory, often favored by those seeking a purely medical explanation: neurological conditions. Some researchers point to conditions like Syms Korea, a disorder that causes involuntary movements, often in children.
So the idea is that everyone dancing was just one big coincidence. Hundreds of people all experiencing the same rare neurological disorder at the same time.
That's where this theory hits a snag. While Syms Korea and similar conditions do exist, they're relatively rare. To explain the dancing plague of 1,500 and 1,800s of people from all walks of life suddenly dancing for days, weeks on end, you'd need an outbreak of unprecedented scale. It's not impossible, but it's highly improbable.
Yeah, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say the dancing saint theory is looking a little more likely at this point. So if we're playing historical detectives here, we've got a few solid leads: mass hysteria, ergot poisoning, and the influence of St. Vitus. What do you think? Which one holds the most weight?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the truth is, there might not be one single answer. What makes the dancing plague so fascinating and so frustrating for historians is that it could have been a perfect storm of multiple factors.
A perfect storm, you say? Elaborate on that.
Picture Strasbourg teetering on the edge. Famine, disease, whispers of curses, and divine retribution. It's a recipe for fear and paranoia. Now, add a dash of ergot poisoning into the mix. People are hallucinating, their bodies are betraying them. It's not hard to see how this could trigger a wave of imitative behavior, especially in a society where public dancing was already a common occurrence.
So it's not a case of either or, but rather a yes and. Multiple factors colliding in this perfect storm of weirdness.
Exactly. It's the interconnectedness of it all that makes this event so compelling. It reminds us that human behavior, especially in times of crisis, is rarely driven by a single, isolated factor. We're talking about a complex web of social, psychological, and even biological factors, all converging at a particular moment in time.
It makes you realize how much context matters. An event like this today would be met with doctors, therapists, scientists. But back then, it was the dancing saint and prayers for forgiveness.
Precisely. And that brings us to another fascinating aspect of this story, the aftermath. What happened when the music finally stopped, so to speak? How did Strasbourg recover from this?
Yeah, did they ever figure out how to make it all stop? It's hard to imagine a town bouncing back from something like that. Did the sources say what the lasting impact was?
The sources paint a somber picture: exhaustion, heart attacks, strokes. The physical toll was undeniable. But beyond the immediate casualties, there was a lingering sense of bewilderment, a collective trauma that likely lingered for generations.
That makes sense. It's not every day you see your friends and neighbors dancing themselves to death.
It really makes you wonder. This happened over 500 years ago, yet we're still trying to piece together the puzzle. What does that say about the limits of our understanding, even with all our modern knowledge?
That's the beauty and frustration of history, isn't it? We have these tantalizing glimpses into the past, these events that challenge our assumptions about human behavior, about the very nature of reality. And sometimes, the best we can do is speculate, theorize, and keep asking questions.
Speaking of questions, you always have a knack for posing those thought-provoking questions that keep me pondering long after the deep dive is over. So, hit me. What should our listeners be chewing on today?
Well, let's start with this. Imagine if something like the dancing plague were to happen today.
Right.
What form would it take? What societal anxieties, what cultural pressures might trigger such a phenomenon in our hyper-connected, information-saturated world?
Ooh, that's a good one. Would it be a mass social media meltdown? A viral TikTok challenge gone horribly wrong? A collective panic attack induced by doom scrolling?
Precisely. The possibilities are both fascinating and a tad unsettling. It makes you wonder, in a world obsessed with rationality and scientific explanation, do we still possess the capacity for this kind of collective, seemingly irrational behavior?
And if so, what does that say about the limits of our control over our own minds and bodies? It's almost as if the dancing plague is this eerie reflection of the anxieties and extremes of our modern world.
Exactly. And that leads to another question our listeners might consider. How much do we really understand about the interplay between the mind and body? The dancing plague, whether rooted in mass hysteria, poisoning, or some complex combination, reminds us that the line between the physical and psychological is often blurred, even today.
It's a good thing I have you to talk me down from the ledge of existential dread. Any final thoughts on this historical head-scratcher?
Just this. The dancing plague, for all its strangeness, reminds us that even in the face of the inexplicable, humans seek answers, patterns, meaning. Whether through religious fervor, scientific inquiry, or simply trying to make sense of the chaos around them, humans are constantly striving to understand themselves and the world they inhabit.
And sometimes those answers lead to even more questions, more mysteries to unravel. Well, folks, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive into the dancing plague of 1518. A big thanks to our expert for joining us and shedding light on this fascinating and, frankly, rather terrifying piece of history.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to delve into these historical enigmas.
Until next time, keep those brain gears turning, and remember, sometimes the most fascinating stories are the ones that leave us with more questions than answers.